I've come a long way. I've come from Western Canada. Calgary, the city of Calgary is located in amongst beautiful mountains. We are the number 4 destination for immigrants in the country. So they go typically to Toronto, to the city of Vancouver, to the city of Montreal, and the city of Calgary. So extremely popular city in terms of immigrants, and we have a lot of immigrants coming into the country. Canada is also known around the world for its multicultural policies. So today's talk is kind of centered around a number of aspects about the Canadian culture. Is this bothering you, the sound a little bit? Is it okay now? Is it better? Can you hear me right at the back? Is it good? Okay. Am I speaking too fast? Is it good? Okay, so if at some point there's something you don't understand, just raise your hand and tell me to repeat. I'll be playing a number of videos in a number of different languages that have subtitles in them. They're short 2 to 3 minute clips with subtitles. I will explain them to you, but if you don't follow, just don't hesitate to interrupt and ask me to explain what I'm talking about. So basically, my research is built around the idea of plurilingualism. Canada officially is a bilingual country. We are one of the few countries that have an explicit multicultural policy, which means that anybody coming into the country is free to learn their language, preserve their culture, their heritage, and their religious beliefs. So it's a multicultural policy that invites immigrants into the country. The idea is that you keep your language, your culture, and at the same time, you move on to become a multicultural citizen where you adopt into mainstream Canadian culture. So this policy was introduced in 1971 in the country. And I can truly say that it is one of the few successful models in the world right now in terms of how we are using and working with this policy, and you see it within the schooling system. Most of my work is within the program of teacher education. So I work in language and literacy. I do a lot of work in second language acquisition, language programs, and one of my primary mandates is to work with minority groups who are coming into the schooling system. So that's new families, new immigrants, parents, community members, and the children who are being admitted into the schools within Canada to help them keep their language and their culture and better adapt into the Canadian system. So the idea is that you are basically embracing the new culture, but you're also keeping your language and your heritage alive at the same time. So that's kind of where this work comes from, building together. That is, we're trying to construct a plurilingual environment. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Canadian context, which is very interesting in terms of statistics. How do I move forward with this? Is it with the... Okay. Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay. So the context is really interesting. Like I said, officially we are a bilingual country. So the 2 official languages in our country are English and French. However, in 2012, our main national newspaper published this article called New Bilingualism Taking Hold in Canada. So basically what they were talking about was that 6.8 million Canadians reported a mother tongue other than English or French, and about 4.7 million speak a language other than English or French, most often at home, okay? So more than 200 mother tongues are spoken in Canada, though only 22 have more than 100,000 speakers in Canada. So the largest spoken language in Canada is Punjabi. This is followed by Chinese, followed by Spanish, followed by Italian, German, Cantonese, Tagalog, Arabic, and Mandarin. So what's interesting about this situation is you can see there are all these other languages, okay, against the backdrop of a bilingual country, a bilingual policy. The question is, what do you do with all these languages? And what is happening in terms of the communities that are speaking these languages, and how are they preserving them? What are the kinds of practices that are being promoted within the public education system? So in our education system, there is a recognition that there's a new kind of bilingualism that's taken hold of the country that doesn't necessarily represent just English and French. It represents all these other languages. So the educational system needs to respond to this diversity that's embedded in society, and that, you know, these communities are well-established communities. They have heritage language schools. Some are being taught within the languages are being taught in temples, in places of worship, in Sunday schools. So it's a whole new generation of children that are being schooled in many ways within the public educational system as well as the community-based system. So our mandate is really to bring these languages into mainstream classrooms in a way that everybody can benefit from what these students know, whether they're multilingual or they're monolingual local Canadians. They can also benefit from the knowledge that is being given to students who are multilingual. So this sort of is the context that I work in. So one of the things that I've been working then on is exploring the affordances of teaching through a multilingual lens. So specifically what this means is that the English language arts curriculum that is being taught to students, irrespective of whether they speak one language, two languages, three languages, it needs to be taught through a multilingual focus. So what this means is that in your day-to-day teaching, as a teacher, you bring in other languages in your classrooms in a way that you involve community, you involve parents, you involve grandparents, you involve sometimes, in many cases, support staff working in the school that happens to speak another language. You involve the students themselves who are from different parts of the world and who speak different languages. So what I've been doing in the past couple of years is that I've been working on a specific genre of books called dual language books. Here it's shortened DLBs. It stands for dual language books. These books are published primarily out of a publishing company based in the United Kingdom. If you Google them, dual language books, you'll find the publishing company. The name is Multilingual. They're publishing books, and the special feature of these books is that each title is produced in up to almost 30 different languages. So for example, you have Cinderella, the original version that was produced in China. It's called Yexin Cinderella. So that has been translated into languages like Albanian, French, Spanish, Somali, all kinds of Arabic. So you have all these different languages. So basically, I've been working with these books with our teacher education program, with candidates like yourself who are becoming teachers, as well as the in-service program with actual teachers teaching in the schooling system, where we have been designing lesson plans and strategies to come up with reading interventions that include several languages at the same time. And what is specific about this type of work is that we work with multiple languages, English always being the second language that's being read. So the kids are exposed to multiple languages being read, and they listen to the same story a number of times in a number of languages, English always being the second language. So the kind of work that I'm doing comes from the idea that language awareness is important if you truly want to make a society plurilingual or multicultural. People have to be aware of their surroundings. So they have to be able to recognize some basic things about language. So you're fortunate in the sense that you're living within the European context, which is in essence more plurilingual than people like ourselves who come from an English-dominated, context. But that said, this work is critical if we want to raise multicultural awareness. I keep telling my students that there's no magic pill that's going to make teachers multicultural. I give everybody a pill, and then the next morning they get up and they're all multicultural, and we're going to create citizens of the world. This is about systemic change. It's about shifting a mindset. And so some of the ideas I work with are around linguistically appropriate practice. So for example, the idea that in a country like Canada, often people enter the country multilingual, so students come and they're multilingual when they come to a school. But by the time the school is finished with them, in terms of their education, sadly, these students are monolingual. So we call this situation a linguistic graveyard. That is, we've created a situation where languages are dying instead of thriving. So no matter how rare those languages are, there must be a way to promote those languages and to revitalize them, which is the case for the indigenous populations around the world as well. Then also the idea that once again, if you think about culturally relevant teaching or pedagogy, this is something that's being talked about around the world. We want to be culturally sensitive to people who are coming from different parts of the world. We want to be able to respond. So some of the things that I work on are connected to the idea of not just responding, but really creating situations that are sustainable. So how do you work towards systemic change? So what I'm saying is that there is a way to incorporate other languages systematically through systemic change, through very deliberate interventions into our daily teaching and our daily lives. So we're not multicultural just once a year, for example. So for example, in Canada, we have something called Black Diversity Month. So everybody celebrates Black culture once in the year. So, you're acknowledging the contributions they've made. We're talking about, their culture, and then that's the end of it. And September comes, we move on back to our, day-to-day teaching that doesn't involve the same things that you would talk about as you would within Black History Month. So just that sort of thing, that is, you need to do it on a daily basis in a very systematic way. So then, thinking about language then, we know, and I'm sure you've talked about this within your program, that is, the bilingual has, or should have two separate and isolable language competencies. So we're learning more and more that, it's not that simple to divide these things, and that I'm sure many of you are bilingual, multilingual yourself. You switch from one language to the other. You think in a language, you respond in another. If you're thinking in Catalan, you may switch to Spanish to say something very specific, and then there's some things that are so culturally specific to Catalan that you cannot possibly say the same thing in French or Italian. It's very specific to being Catalan, to being a part of this area. So the same idea, that is, we're recognizing in teaching that if you're going to create successful students who are able to read and write, whether it's English or it's French or it's Italian, they need to be engaged, and we need to recognize their ability to switch from one language to the other. So this idea has been developed in many ways. The idea of translanguaging, for example. So just because I switch, for example, from English to French to say something doesn't mean that I don't know the word in English, but it can also possibly mean that I'm deliberately using the French word to say something that would not have the same meaning had I used only English, right? So that's something that teachers and generally the field of education is recognizing. So for example, when you think about making visible the dynamic nature of linguistic competence and practices. You think about translanguaging. So something that's very interesting is this quote where they talk about the fact that even though Spanish runs through my heart, English rules through my veins. Have any of you ever experienced this idea of a language that you feel more than another language? Yes? No? Yeah, I see you nodding. So yeah, so that idea, right? So there's something about English that, you know, we know that, okay, this is the functional language in Canada, but I might be from a Hispanic family and Spanish is the language of my heart. It's the way I will express my emotions, my anger, my joy, my happiness. So similarly, the students that are coming into Canada, into Canadian classrooms, teachers recognize that there is this idea that, you know, these students have another language of the heart that's running through their home life, and that somehow we need to find a way to bring those languages into the public sphere. Okay, so then what have I been doing all these years? So what I've been trying to construct a multilingual ecology, or what others have called a translanguaging zone. So what does this mean? This means that the linguistic landscape of classroom reflects the multilingualism of children. So the students you're teaching, make your classroom a space where it's actually reflecting the identities of the people you're teaching to. All ways of using language in classrooms in conversation with each other. So there is not one language that's superior over the other. They're all equal. So therefore, there is no judgment being passed about which language is better or which is powerful, but the fact that we find languages interesting as teachers, and we want our students to be able to connect the dots and understand that there is a connection between languages and that it's an interesting topic of conversation from a social justice point of view as well. The idea also that, you know, meta-linguistic awareness, the ability to understand how languages work, the ability to be conscious of sounds, of, you know, how you ask a question in one language, how is it different in another language, the ability to recognize scriptures or to be aware of the directionality, for example. So Arabic starts from the right, not from the left of the page. Japanese goes from the top, not from the right of the page. So things like that. And similarly, building linguistic tolerance towards each other, working against linguistic hierarchies, and also integrating families and communities. So these are the kind of things I have been working on with teachers in Canada. Now, like I said, why is it important? It's important because we know from a research point of view that you will be able to increase literacy levels and engagement if you will respond to the populations that you're teaching in more meaningful ways. That is, if you talk about things that are relevant to these children and their families, and you touch on social realities. For example, immigration is a big theme. Displacement is a big theme. Refugee status is a big theme, right? So these are things that basically are influencing everybody around us in different ways. They're impacting families. So incorporating some of those stories that people are dealing with in their daily lives. And also the fact that if we are generally going to be able to scaffold this type of instruction and this type of material in our day-to-day teaching, we will for sure get a higher level of engagement in terms of the response that we'll get from the students and their families. So I have been working in a very diverse context. Just to give you an idea, I work in schools where, for example, if it is a school with 600 students, there are about 100 different languages represented demographically. So, there are all kinds of dialects. Some are rare languages, other are more common. There are all kinds of languages that families are bringing. And very often, demographically, when families come into the schooling system, they are also afraid to disclose the languages that they speak at home, because they feel that in many ways their children might be labeled as being deficient in terms of English as a first language. So they're very reluctant to give any information to the Board of Education in terms of what the home language is. So this is like another challenge that we go through. So coming back to meta-linguistic awareness, that I call MLA, and mainstream literacy programming, which means, for example, if you're teaching Catalan as the main language of instruction, or you're teaching Spanish, what I'm saying is that within that context, meta-linguistic awareness is an extremely important construct to think about. So why is it so? What I'm saying is that when we look at the kind of instructional practices that are visible across the globe, whether you look at the United Kingdom, or you look at Australia, you look at New Zealand, you look at the United States, you have all these methods to teach, literacy, basic literacy to students. So there is a lack of instructional material and resources to foster meta-linguistic awareness in very explicit ways. And that's the kind of work that I've been trying to do. And then there's the idea that actually, if you're multilingual or bilingual, reading in 2 languages, or 3 or 4 or 5, can actually be a very interesting idea, because you can do several things with it. You can think about language as an object of thought. So for example, if somebody is reading to you in Arabic, what is it about Arabic that's interesting? What is it about the letters that's different? Why does it sound different? Where does this language come from? And also the people who are reading, for example, to the students in the classroom, what is it about their persona in that specific moment that makes it culturally relevant? So the idea of thinking about language as a cultural amplifier. So I'll show you some videos of classrooms where teachers are working with parents and grandparents to basically read to the students in several languages. And there are different ways of doing this. That's the neat thing about these kind of resources. You can use them in a number of ways, and each time there's something interesting in terms of language awareness, in terms of cultural amplification, and in terms of meta-linguistic awareness for these methods. So here are some examples of dual language books. So like I said, you can go to Multilingual. If you Google it, you will find this amazing website. They give you student discounts if you're interested in buying these books. They ship them. They provide you with free sample material if you're teachers in the system and you'd like to use some of their resources. They're also looking for people to translate different books. They also look for people to write different stories. So their website is constantly being updated. It's an amazing resource. So these books, I tried and tested them with teachers for more than a decade now. We initially began with a few that were available in the public library system, and then slowly we got the Board of Education to order these books and provide them to various libraries in the city. And now there are many schools that actually have quite a large collection of these books, and they use them with their students depending on the kind of demographics they have. So we have, I'm sure you have the same thing in your city of Barcelona. Different parts of the city have different pockets of immigrant populations where there's a majority, for example, maybe of Africans who speak African languages, or maybe Somali or Arabic or different. So the schools are responding to that kind of diversity by bringing in these books. So with the teachers over the past decade, I've been working on curriculum alignment. So what we had a team of experts sit around the table and talk to us, and we said, okay, well, if I were to give you 10 books and I was to say, tell me, what can you do with these books when you're teaching English language to your students? Are these books of any relevance? Can you align them with your program of studies? So we actually sat down with them and did the work with them collaboratively, where, for example, we looked at middle school level. This is an example of middle school. I'd say about 10 to 12-year-old students. So we worked on things like, what makes a children's story? So what's interesting? What is the plot? What about visual literacy and a focus on culture, right? And dealing with emotions. So what makes you happy? So studying themes like acceptance, courage, kindness, honesty. What are the elements of a story? How do you develop a plot? And so there are lots of characteristics, discussion of the 5 senses, for example, or working on a storybook, working on the beginning, the middle, and working on cultural differences with other versions of, for example, Yeshin Cinderella, which was the original Cinderella story. And if you Google it, I think you'll find probably over 20 different versions of Cinderella across the world that can be used in over 30 languages. So imagine the possibility in terms of incorporating this work. And not only has this work been incorporated into the English language arts curriculum, but it's also extended to, for example, social studies and mathematics, different ways of extending the linguistic work to different areas of teaching as well. So I'll give you one example from elementary schools. I had over 150 students work on this study in grade 1 and kindergarten classrooms over 2 years. So what we did was that we had 10 weeks of readings where we had 10 dual language books, and basically each book was read 3 times during the week. So it was read in, for example, Urdu language and English, Punjabi language and English, French and English. So it was repeated. So for example, with the titles, every week the students got the languages in the 4 languages, English always being the second language. We brought in different guest speakers. We brought in grandparents, we brought in mothers, we brought in students. Whoever was willing to read to the class, they were invited to the classrooms. So each session was about 20 to 25 minutes long. And interestingly, we had one group where they had the readings in all of the languages, and then we had another group where they had the readings in only one language, which was English. So interestingly, at the end of the project, the students who were in the monolingual language group heard about the other students who were listening to the stories in so many different languages. So they actually came to us to ask us why they were not being read to in all these other languages. They were really upset about the project, and so they were really annoyed that they were in the monolingual group where they only got the readings in one language. So we did a pre and a post-test for early reading ability, and what we found was basically in no way does reading to young children in a language that they know nothing about. For example, somebody who was born and raised in Western Canada, speaks only English, has been exposed to all these different languages. In no way does it hinder their ability to learn English. If anything, it exposes them phonetically, linguistically to all these different systems, allowing them to progress better in terms of their learning of English language. So I'm going to show you, can I have a little bit of help switching to, maybe just in case, I think we have all the videos here. Okay, so here's a video. I'm going to play this to you. You will see a kindergarten classroom where a teacher is going to read to the students in French, and there is the student teacher who's going to read the same book in English. So this will give you an idea of the procedure. So this is...
What do you think this story is going to be about? Put your hand up. That's one. We sit up. Jeffrey, what do you think this story is going to be about? How can we find out what this story is going to be about? Rick? About a dad and a kid? How do you know?
Because I could see the dad holding the kid's hand.
Oh, very smart. I love how you looked at the picture, Rick, to tell you about the story. What else do you think this story might be about, Victoria?
My dad too.
Anyone else have an idea of what they think the story might be about? Emily? About the kid's dad. You know what? You're absolutely right. Very, very, very smart kindergartners can figure these things out because they use the picture, right? This story is called My Daddy is a Giant. I'm going to read it in French and Mrs. P is going to read it in English for you. Mon papa est un géant.
My daddy is a giant.
Mon papa est un géant. Quand je veux lui faire un câlin, je dois grimper sur une échelle.
My daddy is a giant. When I want to cuddle him, I have to climb a ladder.
Okay, so this sort of gives you an idea of how the reading happened with the younger students. As we moved on, we had the book projected on what we call a smartboard. I think you probably have the same concept in Spain. Smartboards in the classroom where you actually project the book. So what happens is that the teacher can actually point to the book and say, look, the students did not have individual copies of the books, simply because of the cost factor associated with buying so many copies, but they projected it and they incorporated technology so students could actually see the image projected. So my next example is going to be of cultural amplification. So that's video number 2. So I'm going to, I think it's on desktop, so we can just close this one and then go on to that. So what's going to happen here is that you will see the book that's being read is called The Swirling Hijab. The Swirling Hijab is the story of a little girl whose mother wears the scarf, okay? So she covers her head with a scarf. And the word hijab comes from Arabic. So it's a little girl who imagines all the different things that you can possibly do with this scarf of hers. So it was used with, from the point of view of cultural literacy, visual literacy. So we had a mother come in who spoke Urdu, and she actually wore the hijab. So she took a minute to explain to the class what the hijab was, and she quickly told them the linguistic origins of the word hijab and how it came from the Arabic language. So you'll see that happen really quickly. Notice the body language of the mother, who does not have a job in Canada. She considers herself not very fluent in English, and she considers herself underconfident. She was shy to come into the classroom, reluctant to be a part of the study, and she couldn't find a job in Canada. And so they were struggling in that sense. So watch what she does with the children in the classroom.
हिजाब पता है किसको कहते हैं? ये देखो, जैसे मैंने ऊपर सर पे लिया हुआ है, ये लिया, उसको सर ढका हुआ ना मैंने, है ना? इसको अरबी में कहते हैं हिजाब, है ना? तो ये लहरा रहा है, उड़ जा रहा है ना? उड़ता हुआ hijab.
Okay. The swirling hijab.
Okay, so then I have another example of a grade 5 classroom, so around 10 to 11-year-old children. So we wanted to introduce the dual language book reading to this class. So one of the kids, his grandmother was visiting from Mexico. So she had come to Canada for a short visit. So he brought his grandmother who didn't speak any English, so her son came with her and the student is standing with them. So it's the entire family together with the classroom teacher. So you'll see that in Spanish and English. That's video number 3. Yeah, this one.
A Chita y al hipopótamo les encantaba contar chistes. Bueno, la verdad es que era Chita la que contaba los chistes. El hipopótamo se limitaba a escuchar y a reírse a carcajada tendida. Los chistes no eran muy buenos, pero al hipopótamo le hacían mucha gracia y por este motivo eran tan buenos amigos.
Cheetah and hippopotamus loved telling jokes. Actually, Cheetah told the jokes. Hippopotamus just listened and laughed. A deep, bellowy laugh. The jokes weren't very funny, but hippopotamus thought they were, and that's why they were such good friends.
Okay, so this kind of work is really complicated. You know, there's a lot of relationship building. You have to develop relationships in order to make this happen. You have to work with the boards of education. You have to work with teachers, with language specialists. You have to develop collaborative relationships where you invite guest readers into the classroom. There are the students, and then of course the researchers who come with these ideas from the university. So it's very important to understand that it's a two-way kind of relationship building where we went to them with an idea, but then they owned the idea, right? So they took the idea and they worked with it and they said, okay, this is how we see this really work for us, because that's their classroom reality. So it's all that collaboration, the planning. One of the most common things that you would hear in when you take these sort of ideas to teachers would be, yes, this is great, but I don't have the time. I have to teach. Where am I going to find the time from to, you know, do you realize I have exams at the end and my students have all these tests and we have to finish the curriculum? So it was very interesting to see how the ideas evolved and it became this whole interesting, you know, dynamic where so many things took place. So the students created books. There was a lot of bilingual reading, trilingual reading. They created stories in 2, 3, 4 languages. Some were in only English with a few words in different languages that the students had used. So all kinds of, you know, components that were aligned, for example, with the social studies curriculum as well, that talks about global citizenship and social justice outcomes. So, for example, thinking then about what you can do in the higher levels with this type of work, we built in based on the European language portfolio. If you Google the European language portfolio, you will see that this exists for younger children as well. So it's an amazing resource for school teachers. There's so much that you can do. So they took the idea of the language portfolio and they basically made their students work on things like, where do you come from? What languages do you speak? What about your identity? And within that, there was we progressed into a focus on reading and a focus on writing. So, for example, the dual language books were introduced later on, and then we brought in the idea of, you know, what makes a story in several languages. Like, what's interesting about Spanish that's not there in English? And what about French? And what about Arabic? And what about Chinese? And all these other languages. So that's how they progressed in terms of the work. So there was a focus on listening, there was a focus on languages, and there was a focus on post-story questions. In the listening, there was a focus on the phonological features of the new language that they were listening to. So, for example, I've done this in grade 5 and 7 with Tagalog, with Spanish, with Urdu, with French, with all kinds of interesting languages. So the students are then, they get a chance to listen to all these languages. And the objective is not to teach them the language. We cannot possibly do that. We do not have the resources to do that. And we're not trying to do that. The objective is simply to raise awareness and build bridges with communities and bring them into the classrooms, and then make your English language teaching multicultural, because that's what the new English is going to look like. It comes from New Zealand, it comes from England, it comes from Australia, it comes from the United Kingdom, the United States. It doesn't belong to one part of the world. It's all over the world. So that idea of bringing in the different, you know, aspects. So obviously, I mean, this type of work, again, involves community guest readers. There is content integrated classroom activities where we actually, you know, worked with the curriculum, and we actually gave the readers certain prompts as well as ideas, where we encouraged them to come, for example, and share their socio-cultural history of their language. So, for example, the Tagalog readers told the students in grade 5 and grade 7 how, you know, Tagalog was a mixture of so many different languages, and that it had been influenced historically by Spanish, for example, and basically going back, taking them into the roots of the languages that they were hearing. So these are some of the things that the students retained as well in terms of the cultural piece and linguistic piece. This is an example of the European language portfolio. If you go online, you'll find it. You'll see it has a language biography, a language dossier, and a language passport. There are so many things a teacher can do with things like this. Different ideas for incorporating curriculum and basically making it work for your own classroom in terms of your lesson plans. These are some of the things we asked the students about. So what is the first thing you notice, for example, about the language that you're being read to? In what way is the language like or different from English? And what words seem similar to English? So they had a journal where they took down notes, they were writing, they were making observations, they were asking questions, and they were asking the guest readers lots of interesting questions, which was very interesting. It was almost like this sophisticated linguistic analysis that was actually quite shocking and amazing to see young children ask such questions about all these different languages that they were listening to. So there was a lot of, obviously preparation in terms of reminding the students about what they have already heard and how can they use it to build a story. So taking notes, writing down, remembering. So what do you remember about Urdu from last week? Do you remember any sound that was more frequent or less? So students were noticing, for example, alphabets, and they were noticing how linguistically certain languages, there were certain techniques that were used by the speakers that the students would notice. So for example, for Spanish, they noticed that they were rolling their R's in a very specific way, so students were asking questions about that. For Urdu, they noticed the script that was completely different. It's derived from Turkish, Arabic, and Persian, and so it looks very different in comparison to a language like Spanish or Tagalog even. So all these kind of questions that the students were asking. So I'll show you a discussion about languages. This one's happening in grade 5. So you'll see how the students are talking about languages and they're asking questions. How am I doing for time? Okay, so we'll watch a couple of videos before we open it up to questions here. Okay. I think this is, okay, so this one is number 4. Okay. Yeah.
Maya?
Something I realized is that the words seem to have less letters. I guess it's because they have 38 letters in it, and that makes like more sounds if they have 38 letters. So yeah, it has less letters.
Which words have less letters?
Well, the words, words that she.
Oh, I see.
Well, like the words that she were in like her language, they seem to like have less letters.
Yeah, you're right. Like this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Here we have only 3.
Okay.
Why? Because we join them, put them together, and that is how.
Like to us it'd be backwards, but to the like it right from.
Yeah,
That's
we
cool.
start from the right, move to the left.
Yeah.
And in English, we go the other way.
Yeah.
Shaggy?
Why do you join the little parts of the together?
Because that's the way how Urdu is written. If we like just print the letters, it would require a lot of paper to write that. So that is how it was developed. Just made smaller shapes of the same letters. And in Urdu we call them choti ashkal. Choti means small and ashkal means shapes. So choti ashkal of the alphabet of the letters of the alphabet, and we put them together, join them together like this to get words. Okay, so just to show you an example of what this one here, what she was talking about, the kids asked her why the words were joined together in the language Urdu. So this is how they would be joined to make a sentence. And this is how words are created. So she was actually explaining this to the students. She was telling them that you actually write like this, and then you join the words together, and you basically create words and sentences, and that's how you write in this language. So the idea of joining alphabets is different in a language like this in comparison to English or French or Spanish even, right? So the guest reader was talking about this to the students. So maybe we'll just watch, maybe I'll just end by giving some examples rather than the video. Thank you. So here's an example of some of the grade 5 work that they did. For example, so they're writing their observations here. So you see there's Spanish, there's a little bit of Tagalog in the middle. They're writing things that they've noticed about the stories and the various tasks that they were asked to do for Urdu, Tagalog, Spanish, and English in a grade 5 classroom, for example. And here's a story where this student had just come from Uzbekistan. So she had arrived in Canada a while ago. So she paired up with a monolingual student in the classroom to create this story where from time to time she used words in Russian. So when we asked her, we said, why did you use Russian words? So for example, this one says, a long time ago in a country there lived a Khan, okay? So we asked her, we said, you know, why the word Khan, why not just king? So she explained to us that the word Khan had a level of grandeur that the English word king could never reflect. So that idea of majestic, you know, the clothes, the demeanor, the grandeur, that it's the Russian word that gave that feeling of, you know, absolutely being a king. So these were examples of transliteration in the story created collaboratively between the two students. And so here's, notice the drawings that they created, very Central Asian in terms of how she was talking about a legend. And when she talked about truth, she used the word pravda, for example, over here. Same idea, that is to basically give it a certain intensity that could not be expressed through the English language. And that for her, it was the Russian word that kind of demonstrated that feeling of, you know, intensity and absolute truth. So these are just, you know, some examples of how they worked. And here's an example of a student who was of Chinese descent. On New Year, Chinese New Year, his mother made him wear the Chinese outfit to school. So they were actually working on the theme of bullying that week. So the theme in the school was anti-bullying. So the student wrote a story about being bullied in the school by his classmates for wearing Chinese clothes to school. And so he wrote the story in Chinese and English. And so he talked about how he was getting, you know, funny looks from his students. They were making fun of him. They were asking him why he was wearing his Chinese clothes. So he incorporated that into his story, and he incorporated his Chinese that he was learning during Sunday school that he attended over the weekends. Here is the story of Ariba, whose parents came from Ethiopia. She spoke Amharic, and she created this story using Amharic and English together. So she asked her mother to help her with the Amharic language, and so the project inspired her to create her story in the two languages. So these are some excerpts. You can see the Amharic. It's not very clear, but still it sort of gives you the idea of how students worked. This is an example of a worksheet where they've actually used some of the words that were being used by the guest readers. So for example, "Como está" over here has been used for hello, how are you? And then she tried to use it in a sentence. So they were using, similarly, they used the word khush, they used the word rialza and dost and chango and different, words that they had picked up during the readings. So I'm going to just end by saying, what does this mean? What can we take away from all of this? So at the end of the day, it's possible to teach through a multilingual lens. And in doing that, you're living linguistic diversity in a more authentic way. It's more meaningful. It's more powerful. You're meeting the needs of linguistically diverse communities, and you're also doing something very important that we don't think about very often. You're providing monolingual students with a chance to learn from their peers. So they may be, students who are monolingual, they may only speak one language. You're providing them with a very rich opportunity where they recognize that actually I can learn a lot from my peers. Okay, so I think we can stop at that. And if you want a demonstration of how to work with dual language books, you can go on to this link. We can send it later to you. On this, we have a video with student teachers like yourselves who've used the books in different ways, talking about, some of the potential advantages of these books and how they've used them in their various classroom settings. So thank you.